The October rain hammered against the windows of Mark's downtown Chicago penthouse as he raised his glass of Dom Perignon to the ceiling, his voice booming over the bass-heavy music that shook the entire 32nd floor. The apartment was a monument to excess. 3,000 square feet of polished marble, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, and furniture that had been featured in Architectural Digest. Tonight, it was packed with people celebrating what Mark considered the greatest victory of his life. "To freedom!" he shouted, his face flushed with alcohol and triumph. "To finally getting rid of the ball and chain." The crowd of 20-something influencers, business associates, and fair-weather friends erupted in cheers, their glasses clinking together in a symphony of celebration. Mark's best friend Jake slapped him on the back, nearly spilling champagne, on the Italian leather sofa that had cost more than most people's cars, a purchase that Sarah had questioned for weeks before. Mark had simply gone ahead and bought it anyway. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago's young professional scene. Marketing executives from the hottest agencies, tech entrepreneurs riding the wave of their latest funding rounds, social, media personalities with hundreds of thousands of followers, and investment bankers who spoke in numbers that most people couldn't comprehend. They were all here to celebrate Mark's newfound freedom, but more importantly, they were here to see and be seen at what everyone knew would be the party of the month. "Dude, I can't believe you're finally free from Sarah," Jake laughed, his words slurring slightly. He was 34, worked in digital marketing, and had been Mark's closest friend since college. Jake had never particularly liked Sarah, mainly because she'd consistently pointed out the flaws in his get-rich-quick schemes and had encouraged Mark to be more selective about his friendships. "Now you can live your life without someone nagging you about responsibility and all that boring stuff. No more budgets, no more questioning every purchase, no more having to justify why you want to have fun." Mark grinned wickedly, pulling out his phone and scrolling to a photo of the divorce papers he'd signed just hours earlier. The document had taken months to finalize, with lawyers going back and forth over details that Mark had considered petty and vindictive. Sarah had wanted clear agreements about disclosure of major financial decisions, even post-divorce, which Mark had found insulting and controlling. "Look at this beautiful signature, boys and girls. 12 years of marriage, gone with one stroke. Of the pen. And the best part? She didn't fight for a single penny. Too proud, too dignified. Exactly what I expected from Miss Perfect." The party guests laughed and cheered. But what they didn't know was that just 3 miles away, in a modest coffee shop in Lincoln Park, Sarah Whitman sat quietly at a corner table, her own copy of those same divorce papers folded neatly beside her laptop. The coffee shop was called Margaret's Place, a cozy establishment with mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, and the kind of authentic atmosphere that Mark had always dismissed as trying too hard to be quirky. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a comfortable sweater that had seen better days, a stark contrast to the designer clothes Mark had insisted she wear during their marriage. At 34, Sarah had the kind of natural beauty that didn't need enhancement, though years of emotional exhaustion had left faint lines around her green eyes. She sipped her black coffee, a luxury she'd learned to appreciate after years of Mark criticizing every small expense, and typed methodically on her laptop, responding to emails from the small consulting firm where she'd been working part-time for the past 2 years. "How are you holding up, honey?" asked Margaret, the 60-year-old owner of the coffee shop who had become something of a mother figure to Sarah during the divorce proceedings. Margaret had watched Sarah transform from a woman who jumped every time her phone buzzed with a text from Mark to someone who could sit peacefully for hours, working on rebuilding her life. Sarah looked up and smiled, a genuine smile that had become more frequent in recent months. "You know what, Margaret? I feel lighter than I have in years. It's strange, but signing those papers felt like I was signing my own freedom." Back at the penthouse, Mark was in full storytelling mode, regaling his audience with exaggerated tales of his marriage. The Chicago skyline glittered behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, but the beauty was lost on the crowd more interested in drama than scenery. The party had been going for 3 hours now, and the alcohol was flowing freely from a bar. that Mark had stocked with premium spirits, craft cocktails, and champagne that cost more per bottle than many people made in a day. "You should have seen her face when I told her I wanted a divorce," Mark continued, his voice taking on a cruel edge that made some of the guests shift uncomfortably. Several people in the crowd were secretly recording parts of the conversation, on their phones, partly for social media, and partly because they sensed they were witnessing something that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. She actually had the nerve to ask if we could try counseling. Counseling. As if sitting in some therapist's office talking about feelings was going to fix the fact that I was bored out of my mind. Jessica Martinez, a 26-year-old marketing executive who had been trying to catch Mark's attention all evening, leaned closer. She worked for one of Chicago's most prestigious advertising agencies and was exactly the kind of young, ambitious professional that Mark found exciting after years of what he considered Sarah's predictable routine. What was she like? I mean, what kind of person stays married to someone who's clearly outgrown them? Mark's eyes lit up with malicious glee, and several of his friends exchanged glances. They'd all known Mark and Sarah as a couple, and while Sarah had never been particularly warm to Mark's party crowd, she'd always been polite and intelligent. Some of them remembered her quite fondly, which made Mark's current character assassination uncomfortable to watch. Mark's eyes lit up with malicious glee. Sarah was safe, predictable, boring. Mark gestured expansively, champagne sloshing in his glass. She had this whole routine. Wake up at 6, make some organic breakfast that probably cost more than a normal meal. Go to her little part-time job where she helps small businesses with their marketing strategies. Come home and try to talk to me about our relationship goals and 5-year plans. God, it was suffocating. She never wanted to travel anywhere interesting, never wanted to take risks, never wanted to live life on the edge. She was perfectly content with our safe little suburban life while I was trying to build an empire. What Mark was conveniently omitting from his narrative was that Sarah had been the one managing their household finances for the first 8 years of their marriage, turning Mark's sporadic income from various business ventures into a stable foundation for their life together. She'd been the one who had carefully invested their early savings, researching mutual funds and index funds with the methodical approach of someone who understood that wealth was built slowly and carefully. She'd been the one who had researched and negotiated the purchase of their first home, a modest 3-bedroom house in a good neighborhood that had appreciated significantly over the years. Most importantly, Sarah had been the one who had built the foundation of wealth that had allowed Mark to take increasingly bigger risks with his tech startup investments and venture capital opportunities. The penthouse they were currently partying in had been purchased with money that Sarah had saved and invested during the early years of their marriage, when Mark was still figuring out his career path and jumping from one business idea to another. But in Mark's revisionist history, Sarah's caution had been weakness, her planning had been controlling, and her love had been suffocating. He'd convinced himself that her questions about his investment strategies were signs of distrust rather than genuine concern, and her requests for transparency about their finances were attempts to control him rather than protect their shared future. It was easier to paint her as the villain in his story than to acknowledge that her conservative approach had been the foundation of everything he was now celebrating. "The funniest part," Mark continued, now gesturing wildly with his champagne glass, "is that she thinks she's going to be just fine on her own. She's got this little consulting business, if you can even call it that, helping small businesses with their marketing strategies. It's adorable, really. Like watching a kid playhouse." Jake raised his glass again. "Well, here's to Sarah finding out what the real world is like without her wealthy husband to fall back on." The crowd cheered again, but this time, a few people exchanged glances. There was something unsettling about the viciousness in Mark's voice, something that made the celebration feel less like joy and more like cruelty. Meanwhile, Sarah was closing her laptop and preparing to leave the coffee shop. Tomorrow would bring an early morning meeting with a potential new client, a mid-sized restaurant chain called Chicago Eats that was looking to expand their digital marketing presence across the Midwest. It was exactly the kind of work she'd been building toward for the past 2 years. The kind of opportunity that made her grateful for every late night she'd spent learning new skills and building her business, while Mark had been out networking at expensive restaurants and exclusive clubs. The restaurant chain was family-owned, started by immigrants who had built their business one location at a time over 30 years. Their story resonated with Sarah because it reminded her of the value of steady, consistent growth rather than the boom or bust mentality that had increasingly dominated Mark's approach to business. They needed help transitioning from traditional advertising methods to digital marketing, and Sarah had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive proposal that addressed not just their immediate needs, but their long-term growth strategy. As she gathered her things, her laptop bag, and the portfolio of materials she'd prepared for tomorrow's meeting, her phone buzzed with a text from her divorce attorney, David Chen. David was in his early 40s, a respected family law attorney who had guided Sarah through the divorce process with patience and wisdom. He'd been particularly helpful in ensuring that the prenuptial agreement they'd signed years earlier was properly enforced, protecting both parties' interests while allowing for a clean separation. Papers are filed and finalized. Congratulations on your new beginning, Sarah. You're going to do great things. Sarah smiled and typed back, "Thank you for everything, David. I couldn't have navigated this without your help." What Sarah didn't tell David, what she hadn't told anyone yet, was about the email she'd received that morning from Hamilton and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious investment firms. The subject line had been simple: "Business opportunity. Confidential discussion requested." The message itself had been professionally written, but deliberately vague, requesting a meeting to discuss a significant consulting opportunity that they claimed could only be shared in person due to the sensitive nature of the work. The email had come at an interesting time. Sarah had been quietly building her reputation in the Chicago business community, and her work helping small businesses develop sustainable financial strategies had apparently caught the attention of larger firms. She'd heard of Hamilton and Associates. They managed investments for some of Chicago's wealthiest families and had a reputation for conservative, long-term wealth preservation strategies that aligned with her own financial philosophy. The timing felt important, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Starting a new consulting relationship with a firm like Hamilton and Associates could open doors she'd never even imagined, potentially allowing her to work with clients who needed sophisticated financial planning and risk assessment services. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that could transform her small consulting business into something much larger and more impactful. Back at the penthouse, the party was reaching its peak intensity. Mark had moved on from telling stories about Sarah to bragging about his latest investment opportunities, surrounded by a group of admirers who hung on his every word. The crowd had thinned slightly as some of the more sensible guests had called Ubers and headed home, but the core group of partygoers was still going strong, fueled by expensive alcohol and the intoxicating atmosphere of wealth and celebration. Mark was particularly excited about a new venture capital fund that was focusing on cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, an area he claimed to understand better than most traditional investors. The fund was called Quantum Digital Assets, and according to the marketing materials he'd been shown, it was positioned to take advantage of the next wave of digital financial innovation. "The old rules don't apply anymore," he declared to a Samedian small group gathered around the kitchen island, which was covered with empty bottles, half-eaten appetizers, and Mark's laptop displaying charts and graphs that looked impressive, but were difficult to understand. "While everyone else is playing, it's safe with their boring mutual funds and index funds. I'm positioning myself to make real money, real wealth, the kind of money that changes your life completely." Tommy Rodriguez, a newer addition to Mark's social circle and someone who worked in financial consulting, raised an eyebrow. Tommy was in his early 30s, well-dressed, and had an easy confidence that had quickly made him popular in Mark's crowd. He'd appeared in Mark's life about 18 months earlier, introduced through mutual acquaintances in the tech startup scene, and had quickly become one of Mark's most trusted advisors on investment opportunities. That sounds pretty risky, man, Tommy said, swirling his whiskey thoughtfully. Have you done your due diligence on these crypto funds? Some of them are basically pyramid schemes with better marketing and fancier websites. The regulatory environment is still pretty uncertain, and a lot of these funds are operating in gray areas that could become problems later. Mark's expression darkened for just a moment before he forced his trademark confident smile back into place. The question hit a nerve because it was exactly the kind of thing Sarah would have asked, the kind of detailed analysis she would have insisted on before making any significant financial decision. Tommy. This is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people poor and stuck in the middle class forever. You have to take risks to make money. You have to be willing to bet big to win big. That's how fortunes are made. But what about diversification? Tommy pressed, his voice carrying just enough concern to seem genuine. What about having some stable investments to balance out the risky ones? Even the most successful investors keep some money in conservative assets to protect against downturns. Mark laughed, but it was a harsh sound that cut through the music and conversation around them. Several people nearby turned to look, sensing tension in the exchange. You sound like my ex-wife. Always worried, always conservative, always scared of taking chances. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if we lose money? Look where that got her. Sitting alone in some coffee shop somewhere, probably wondering how she's going to pay rent on whatever tiny apartment she ends up in. The group around them grew quiet, uncomfortable with the venom in Mark's voice. Tommy didn't respond immediately, but he made a mental note to himself. In his experience, people who talk the loudest about their investment success were often the ones taking the biggest risks with money they couldn't afford to lose. They were also the ones most likely to ignore red flags and warning signs because they were so invested in proving their own brilliance. As the night wore on and the party began to wind down, guests started calling Ubers and gathering their coats, leaving behind empty bottles, discarded appetizer plates, and the lingering scent of expensive cologne and poor decisions. The penthouse, which had been filled with laughter and celebration just hours earlier, now felt hollow and slightly desperate, like a stage set after the performance had ended. Mark stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city, lights and feeling a mixture of triumph and something he couldn't quite identify, a hollow feeling that he pushed away with thoughts of all the adventures his newfound freedom would bring. Lake Michigan stretched out beyond the city, dark and vast, reflecting the lights of the buildings like scattered diamonds. It was a view that had cost him a fortune, but tonight it felt like a fitting backdrop for his victory. The apartment was a mess. Champagne glasses were scattered across every surface, some still half full, others knocked over and creating small puddles on the expensive marble floors. The catering leftovers were wilting on silver platters that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Empty bottles of Dom Perignon stood like monuments to excess, and the sound system was still playing music to an increasingly empty room. By 2 a.m., only Jake remained, passed out on the living room sofa with his tie undone and his expensive shirt wrinkled beyond repair. Mark poured himself one last drink, a 30-year-old scotch that he'd been saving for a special occasion, and walked through his penthouse, surveying his domain like a conquering general reviewing his territory. Everything was exactly as he wanted it, expensive, impressive, and entirely his own. No more compromises, no more negotiations, no more considering someone else's opinion before making a decision. The penthouse represented everything he'd wanted: freedom, success, and the ability to live life entirely on his own terms. He picked up the framed photo of him and Sarah from their wedding day that he'd forgotten to put away before the party. It had been sitting on a side table near the kitchen, partially hidden behind a bottle of champagne. The photo showed them on the steps of the Chicago Cultural Center, where they'd been married in a small ceremony attended by close family and friends. Sarah looked radiant in a simple but elegant dress, and Mark remembered how proud he'd felt that day, how certain he'd been that they could build a perfect life together. For just a moment, Looking at Sarah's genuine smile and remembering the hopes they'd shared, he felt a flicker of something that might have been regret. They'd been happy once, hadn't they? There had been lazy Sunday mornings, shared jokes, quiet evenings planning their future together. But those memories felt like they belonged to different people. People who had been naive about what real success looked like. He quickly shook his head and tossed the photo into the garbage can beside his desk, listening to the glass crack as it hit the bottom. Old life, old problems, he muttered to himself. Tomorrow starts the rest of my life. What Mark didn't know was that while he'd been celebrating, a series of events had already been set in motion that would make his words more prophetic than he could have imagined. The divorce papers he'd signed so gleefully contained clauses he'd barely read, agreements he'd made in his eagerness to be free of what he saw as Sarah's financial conservatism. More importantly, the investment decisions he'd been making over the past 6 months, the ones he'd hidden from Sarah during their separation, were about to come due in ways that would test every assumption he'd made about risk, reward, and the true meaning of freedom. As Mark finally headed to bed, Sarah was in her small but comfortable one-bedroom apartment, reviewing the business plan she'd been working on for months. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and the chance to build something entirely her own. For the first time in years, she was excited about what the future might hold. The divorce was finalized, the celebration was over, and both Sarah and Mark were about to discover that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another entirely different kind of tale. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, with the kind of Chicago weather that made everyone walk a little faster and pull their coats a little tighter. Mark woke up with a splitting headache and the lingering taste of too much champagne, but his mood was surprisingly upbeat. The divorce party had been everything he'd hoped for, a clear signal to everyone in his social and professional circles that he was back on the market and ready for bigger and better things. He stumbled to his kitchen, stepping over Jake, who was still unconscious on the sofa, and made himself an espresso with the $15,000 Italian machine that Sarah had always called an unnecessary extravagance. As he sipped the perfectly extracted coffee, he felt a surge of satisfaction. No more comments about wasteful spending, no more guilt about enjoying the finer things in life. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, the marketing executive from the party. Had such a great time last night. Want to grab dinner this week? Mark grinned and was about to respond when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Hamilton and Associates, the investment firm he'd been working with on his latest venture capital opportunities. Mark, how's the newly single life treating you? Came the boisterous voice of Richard Hamilton, senior partner and the man who had been guiding Mark's recent investment strategy. Can't complain, Rich. Freedom feels pretty amazing. I bet it does. Listen, I'm calling with some fantastic news. Remember that blockchain fund I mentioned? The one with the guaranteed 12% minimum return? Well, they're closing the sell. Investment window earlier than expected. If you want in, we need to move today. Mark felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been waiting for. A chance to make serious money without Sarah's cautious voice in his ear, questioning every decision and asking for detailed risk assessments. How much are we talking about? Mark asked, already knowing he was going to say yes. Well, you'd mentioned you could go as high as $2 million. With your liquid assets and the equity line on your penthouse, that's totally doable. But like I said, we need to move fast. These opportunities don't come around often. $2 million. It was a significant chunk of Mark's available funds, but the promised returns would more than make up for it. In his mind, he was already calculating how much money he'd make over the next year. Enough to buy a bigger penthouse, maybe a place in Miami. Definitely enough to show everyone that divorce had been the best decision he'd ever made. Let's do it, Mark said without hesitation. Send me the paperwork. What Mark didn't know was that 3 miles away, Sarah was sitting in a conference room at Hamilton and Associates, reviewing a very different set of documents. She wore a simple but professional black blazer and had her hair pulled back in a neat bun, projecting an air of quiet competence that had impressed everyone she'd met that morning. Mrs. Whitman? Said David Hamilton. Richard's younger brother and the more conservative partner in the firm. "I have to say, your financial analysis of our risk assessment protocols is remarkably thorough. Where did you learn to evaluate investment strategies at this level?" Sarah smiled modestly. "I've always been interested in financial planning, and I had a lot of time to study during my marriage. My ex-husband was very focused on high-risk, high-reward investments, so I spent years researching the other side of the equation, how to protect assets and build sustainable wealth." David nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of perspective we need here. Too many of our clients get caught up in the excitement of big returns and forget about the fundamentals. We're looking for someone who can help us develop more comprehensive risk assessment tools for our higher-end clients." "I'd be very interested in that," Sarah replied. "I've actually been working on some models that might be helpful. They're designed to help investors understand not just the potential upside of their investments, but the real-world impact if things go wrong." As Sarah and David continued their conversation, neither of them realized that in the office next door, Richard was on the phone with Mark, enthusiastically selling him on an investment that his own brother would have strongly advised against. Back at the penthouse, Mark was feeling more confident than ever. He'd just wired $2 million to an investment fund that promised incredible returns. He had dinner plans with an attractive younger woman, and he was finally free to live his life exactly as he wanted. Jake had finally woken up and was making himself coffee, still wearing yesterday's clothes and looking like he'd been hit by a truck. "Dude, you look way too happy for someone who should be hungover," Jake groaned, squinting against the morning light streaming through the windows. "That's because I just made the smartest financial decision of my life," Mark replied, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. "While you were sleeping off your champagne hangover, I was securing my financial future." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Mark explained the blockchain investment, watching Jake's expression grow increasingly concerned. "Mark, man, are you sure about this? $2 million is a lot of money, even for you. And blockchain investments. I mean, didn't you learn anything from the crypto crash a few years ago?" Mark's good mood flickered slightly. "This is different, Jake. This is a professionally managed fund with guaranteed minimum returns. It's not some random cryptocurrency speculation." "Guaranteed. By who?" Jake pressed. "And what happens if the fund goes under? What kind of insurance do they have?" These were exactly the kinds of questions Sarah would have asked, and Mark felt a familiar surge of irritation. "This is why most people stay poor, Jake. They're too scared to take real risks. They ask too many questions instead of recognizing opportunity when it knocks." Jake held up his hands in surrender. Okay. I'm sure you know what you're doing. It just seems like a lot of money to put in one place." What neither Mark nor Jake knew was that the guaranteed returns Richard Hamilton had promised were based on projections that assumed perfect market conditions and ignored several critical risk factors. The blockchain fund had impressive marketing materials and a track record that looked solid on paper, but a deeper investigation would have revealed that most of their previous successes had come during an unusually favorable market period that was already showing signs of ending. Meanwhile, Sarah was wrapping up her meeting at Hamilton & Associates with a job offer that would change her life. David Hamilton had been so impressed with her financial acumen and risk assessment skills that he'd offered her a position as a senior consultant, specializing in helping high-net-worth clients develop more balanced investment strategies. The salary is competitive, David explained. But more importantly, you'd be working with clients who really need someone with your perspective. Too many wealthy individuals make investment decisions based on emotion rather than analysis. They need someone who can help them see the bigger picture. Sarah felt a thrill of excitement. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been dreaming of. A chance to use her skills in a meaningful way while building real financial security for herself. "I'm very interested," she said. "When would you need an answer?" "Take your time," David replied. "But I hope you'll consider starting as soon as possible. We have several clients who could benefit from your expertise right away." As Sarah left the Hamilton and Associates building, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. The divorce had been painful, but it had also been necessary. For the first time since her early 20s, she was building something that was entirely her own. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Emily. "How did the meeting go? Are you going to take the job?" Sarah smiled and typed back, "I think this might be exactly what I've been waiting for." Back at the penthouse, Mark was getting ready for his dinner date with Jessica, choosing between 3 different designer shirts and feeling like he was 25 again. The $2 million investment had been processed, and he'd received confirmation that his money was now working for him in what Richard Hamilton had described as one of the most promising opportunities in the alternative investment space. As he selected his most expensive watch, a Rolex that had cost more than many people's annual salary, Mark caught sight of himself in the mirror and liked what he saw. At 36, he was still in good shape, still handsome, still successful. The divorce had freed him from the weight of compromise and caution that had been holding him back. His phone rang again, this time showing a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Whitman, this is Jennifer Lopez from First National Bank. I'm calling about your credit line application." Mark frowned. He hadn't applied for any new credit lines recently. "I think you might have the wrong person." "No, sir. I have the right information. You applied for a home equity line of credit against your penthouse property. The application shows that you're requesting access to $1.8 million in equity." Mark's stomach dropped. He had signed some paperwork earlier that morning as part of the investment process, but he'd assumed it was just standard documentation. "Can you tell me more about what I supposedly applied for?" Jennifer's voice took on a more cautious tone. "Sir, according to our records, you submitted a completed application this morning, along with all required documentation. The application states that you want to use the equity to make additional investments through Hamilton and Associates." Mark's hands began to shake slightly. He'd been so focused on the promised returns, and so eager to move quickly, that he hadn't carefully read all the documents Richard Hamilton had sent him. "What exactly did I agree to?" "Mr. Whitman, you've applied for a credit line that would essentially allow you to borrow against your home's value. If the investments don't perform as expected, you would be responsible for paying back the full amount, plus interest, regardless of what happens to the money you've invested." The room seemed to spin slightly around Mark. He'd just committed not only $2 million of his own money, but had also put his home at risk as collateral for additional investments he hadn't even realized he was making. I need to review some documents," he managed to say. "Can you hold off on processing anything until I call you back? I'm sorry, sir. But the application was marked as urgent and time-sensitive. It's already been approved and the funds have been transferred to Hamilton and Associates, as per your instructions." Mark ended the call and immediately tried to reach Richard Hamilton, but the call went straight to voicemail. A cold dread was beginning to settle in his stomach, replacing the confidence and excitement he'd felt just hours earlier. He looked around his penthouse, his beautiful, expensive penthouse that he now realized might not actually be his anymore. And for the first time since the divorce party, he wondered if his celebration had been premature. Outside, the October rain was getting heavier, and the Chicago skyline that had looked so beautiful and full of promise just that morning now seemed gray and ominous. Mark poured himself a drink with shaking hands and tried to convince himself that everything would work out fine. After all, Richard Hamilton was a professional. The investments were guaranteed. What could possibly go wrong? As if in answer to his question, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Major blockchain investment fund under federal investigation for fraudulent activity. Mark's blood ran cold as he read the headline, but he told himself it couldn't possibly be related to his investment. There were hundreds of blockchain funds out there. The chances that this news story had anything to do with his money were virtually zero. But as he clicked on the article and began to read, he saw a name that made his heart stop. Quantum Digital Assets, managed by Hamilton and Associates, is among the funds being investigated. The drink slipped from Mark's hand, shattering on the expensive marble floor. In the space of 12 hours, he had gone from celebrating his freedom to potentially losing everything he'd worked for. And somewhere across the city, Sarah was enjoying a quiet dinner alone, reading a book and planning her new career, completely unaware that the man who had celebrated their divorce was about to discover the true cost of his choices. Tuesday morning brought news that would change everything. Mark hadn't slept at all, spending the entire night researching quantum digital assets and discovering that the guaranteed returns Richard Hamilton had promised were about as reliable as a weather forecast in Chicago. The federal investigation wasn't just a minor inquiry, it was a full-scale operation involving the FBI, the SEC, and the Attorney General's office. By 6 a.m., Mark had consumed an entire pot of coffee and filled 3 legal pads with notes, desperately trying to understand exactly how much money he'd lost and what his options might be. The numbers were devastating. Between the initial $2 million investment and the home equity line that had been automatically triggered, he had committed nearly $4 million to a fund that was now frozen by federal investigators. His phone had been ringing constantly. Since midnight, reporters, other investors, and a dozen calls from numbers he didn't recognize. He'd stopped answering after the third journalist asked him to comment on being one of the victims of Chicago's largest investment fraud in decades. At 7:30 a.m., his doorbell rang. Mark opened it to find 2 men in suits holding badges and folders thick with documents. "Mr. Whitman?" "I'm Agent Rodriguez with the FBI, and this is Agent Chen with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We'd like to ask you some questions about your recent investments with Hamilton and Associates." Mark's legs felt weak. Am I in trouble? Agent. Rodriguez's expression was neutral but not unkind. "Not necessarily, sir. We believe you may be a victim of fraud, but we need to understand the extent of your involvement and what information you might have that could help our investigation." The next 3 hours were a blur of questions, documents, and increasingly, bad news. Mark learned that Richard Hamilton had been operating what amounted to a Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay returns to earlier investors while skimming millions for himself. The blockchain investments had been largely fictional, existing primarily on paper and in marketing materials designed to attract wealthy clients looking for exclusive opportunities. The most devastating revelation came when Agent Chen explained the legal implications. "Mr. Whitman, I need you to understand that even though you were deceived, you're still legally responsible for the debts you incurred. The home equity line you signed gives the bank the right to foreclose on your property if you can't make the payments, and those payments start next month." Mark stared at the agent in disbelief. "But I was defrauded. Doesn't that change anything?" "It means you may eventually recover some of your money through the legal process," Agent Rodriguez explained. "But that could take years, and there's no guarantee. Meanwhile, your creditors aren't going to wait for the courts to sort everything out." After the agents left, Mark sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled papers, trying to process the magnitude of his situation. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from celebrating his freedom to facing the possibility of losing his home, his savings, and potentially his entire lifestyle. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Looking forward to dinner tonight. Should I meet you at that place in River North you mentioned?" Mark stared at the message, realizing that he'd completely forgotten about their date. How could he possibly sit across from her at an expensive restaurant, pretending everything was fine when his world was collapsing around him? He typed and deleted a dozen different responses before finally settling on, "Something came up. Rain check?" Her response came quickly. "Everything okay?" Mark didn't know how to answer that question, so he didn't. Meanwhile, across the city, Sarah was having the best morning she'd had in months. She'd accepted the position at Hamilton and Associates and was already making plans to transition her existing consulting clients to her new role. David Hamilton had been incredibly supportive, even offering to let her work from home 2 days a week so she could maintain some of her independent projects. What Sarah didn't know yet was that the Hamilton and Associates, where she'd been hired, was a completely different company from the Hamilton and Associates that had just defrauded her ex-husband. David Hamilton ran a legitimate, conservative investment firm that specialized in protecting wealth rather than chasing unrealistic returns. The similarity in names was pure coincidence, a fact that would become important later. Sarah was in Margaret's coffee shop, celebrating with a blueberry muffin and a cappuccino, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Mark's number, which surprised her. They'd agreed to maintain minimal contact after the divorce, communicating only when absolutely necessary. "Hello, Mark," she answered cautiously. "Sarah." Mark's voice sounded strange, hoarse and shaky. I need to ask you something. About the prenup we signed." Sarah frowned. They'd settled all the financial details months ago, and everything had been finalized with the divorce. "What about it?" There was a clause. Something about disclosure of major financial decisions. "I can't find my copy of the agreement, and I need to understand what it means." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She remembered that clause very well. She'd insisted on it after Mark had made several large investments without consulting her during their marriage. The clause stated that any financial decision involving more than $100,000 required disclosure to both parties, even during separation proceedings. "Mark, what's going on? Why are you asking about this now?" There was a long pause. "I made some investments yesterday, large ones, and I'm wondering if there might be legal implications because I didn't mention them during the divorce proceedings." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. "How large, Mark?" $4 million. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even during their marriage, when Mark had been at his most reckless, he'd never made a single investment that large. $4 million. "Mark, where did you get $4 million? "That's not important right now," Mark said quickly. "What's important is whether the prenup clause means anything. Can you look at your copy?" Sarah was already pulling out her laptop, her mind racing. "Mark, you're scaring me. What kind of investments are we talking about? Just, please, can you check the clause?" Sarah found the digital copy of their prenuptial agreement and scrolled to the financial disclosure section. As she read the carefully worded legal language, her expression grew increasingly concerned. "Mark, this clause says that any major financial decision made during separation proceedings without proper disclosure could be considered a violation of the agreement. But more importantly, it says that if one party makes financial decisions that could affect the other party's settlement, they're required to notify their ex-spouse within 48 hours. What does that mean exactly?" Sarah was beginning to understand why Mark sounded so panicked. "It means that if you made investments using assets that were part of our marital property, like your share of our joint savings or equity in shared property, I might have legal standing to challenge those investments, especially if they were made fraudulently or without proper disclosure." The line was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I think I've made a terrible mistake." For the past 12 years, Sarah had watched Mark make increasingly risky financial decisions, always justifying them with talk of potential rewards and accusing her of being too conservative when she expressed concern. She'd learned to trust her instincts about financial matters, and every instinct she had was now screaming that something was very wrong. "Mark, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Not because I want to take advantage of you, but because, if you've been defrauded, there might be ways to protect both of us." Over the next hour, Mark told Sarah everything. The party, the investment, the federal investigation, the home equity line, and the devastating realization that he might lose everything. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes and asking clarifying questions when she needed more details. When Mark finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time. "Sarah, are you still there?" "I'm here," she said softly. "Mark, I think you need a lawyer. A really good one. And you need one today. I can't afford a really good lawyer anymore. I can barely afford any lawyer." Sarah closed her eyes, wrestling with a decision she'd never thought she'd have to make. Despite everything Mark had put her through, despite the humiliation of this divorce party and the years of financial stress he'd caused, she couldn't just stand by and watch him lose everything. "Mark, I want you to call David Chen, my divorce attorney. Tell him I referred you and that you need help immediately. Tell him—" She paused, knowing she was about to do something that might seem crazy to everyone who knew their history. "Tell him I'm willing to consult on your case if it would help." "Sarah, why would you do that? After everything I've said and done?" Sarah looked out the window of the coffee shop, watching people hurry by in the October rain, all of them dealing with their own struggles and challenges, because despite everything, we were married for 12 years, and because no one deserves to be defrauded, not even someone who threw a party to celebrate divorcing me. After Sarah hung up, she sat quietly for a few minutes, processing what she'd just learned. Mark's investment decisions were reckless and foolish, but they were also heartbreaking. She could see the pattern clearly, a man so desperate to prove his independence and success that he'd made decisions without any of the careful analysis that had protected them during their marriage. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Hamilton. Sarah, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. There's been some confusion because our firm has a similar name to another investment company that's currently under federal investigation. Just wanted to make sure you knew we're completely separate organizations. See you Monday." Sarah stared at the text, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. She quickly searched online for Hamilton and Associates Chicago investment fraud and found dozens of news articles about Richard Hamilton and his fraudulent blockchain fund. As she read the details, she realized that Mark had been victimized by the disreputable Hamilton firm, while she'd been hired by the legitimate one. The irony was almost too much to bear. While Mark had been celebrating his freedom from her supposedly conservative financial approach, he'd fallen victim to exactly the kind of fraud she'd spent years learning to identify and avoid. Meanwhile, she'd landed a job at a firm that specialized in protecting people from the very mistakes Mark had just made. Sarah finished her coffee and began making a list of everything she'd need to do to help Mark navigate the legal and financial crisis he'd created. She wasn't doing it because she wanted to get back together with him, or because she felt guilty about the divorce. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do, and because she had the knowledge and skills that might help him salvage something from the disaster. As she packed up her laptop and prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sarah couldn't help but think about how different their lives had become in just a few days. Mark had celebrated his freedom with champagne and cruel jokes, while she'd quietly built the foundation for a new career and a new life. Now Mark was facing financial ruin, while Sarah was positioned to help other people avoid the exact same mistakes. Sometimes, she thought, life had a way of balancing the scales in the most unexpected ways. Her phone rang again. David Chen, her divorce attorney. "Sarah, I just got a call from your ex-husband. He sounds absolutely panicked and mentioned something about federal investigators. What's going on?" Sarah took a deep breath. "David, I think we're about to get very busy, and I think Mark is going to learn some hard lessons about the difference between taking smart risks and just gambling with your life." Outside, the rain was still falling, washing the streets clean and preparing the city for whatever came next. 3 weeks had passed since Mark's world collapsed, and the situation had somehow gotten even worse. The federal investigation had expanded. More victims had come forward, and Richard Hamilton had disappeared entirely, leaving behind a trail of empty bank accounts and forged documents. Mark's penthouse was officially in foreclosure, his credit was destroyed, and he'd been forced to move in with Jake temporarily. A humiliating come-down for someone who'd been bragging about his success just a month earlier. The worst part wasn't the financial devastation, though that was certainly crushing. The worst part was the isolation. Friends who had celebrated at his divorce party now avoided his calls. Business associates who had once courted his investments were nowhere to be found. Even Jessica, the marketing executive he'd been so excited to date, had stopped responding to his messages after the story about his losses made the local business news. Mark sat in Jake's small Lincoln Park apartment, surrounded by boxes of belongings he'd salvaged from the penthouse, staring at a stack of legal documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language. David Chen had been helpful, but the legal options were limited and expensive. The best-case scenario involved years of litigation with no guarantee of recovering any significant amount of money. His phone buzzed with yet another call from a creditor. Mark had stopped answering these calls days ago, but the voicemails were getting increasingly aggressive. The reality of his situation was setting in. At 36 years old, he was essentially starting over with less than nothing. Jake emerged from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, his expression a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed frustration. Living with Mark had been like watching a slow-motion car crash. Every day brought new revelations about how deep the financial hole had become. "Any word from your lawyer?" Jake asked, settling into the opposite chair. Mark shook his head. "David Chen says the FBI is making progress on the investigation, but recovering funds could take years, and even then, we might only get pennies on the dollar." He gestured at the legal documents. "Meanwhile, I owe money. I don't have to people who don't care that I was defrauded." "What about Sarah? Didn't she say she might be able to help somehow?" Mark's expression darkened. The irony of needing help from his ex-wife, the woman whose financial caution he'd mocked publicly, was almost unbearable. "She's been surprisingly supportive, but I don't see what she can actually do. She's got her new job and her new life. Why would she want to get dragged into my mess?" What Mark didn't know was that Sarah had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, using her new position at the legitimate Hamilton and Associates to research the fraud case and identify potential legal strategies. David Hamilton had been impressed by her dedication and had given her permission to spend company time on the case, recognizing that her personal connection to one of the victims provided valuable insight into how the fraud had operated. Sarah was currently in her new office, a modest but comfortable space with windows overlooking Grant Park, reviewing financial documents that painted a very different picture of Mark's situation than he understood. Her analytical skills, honed by years of managing their household finances and recently enhanced by her new role, had uncovered something that everyone else had missed. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Sarah, David Chen is here to see you. He says it's about the Hamilton fraud case." Sarah looked up from her computer screen, where she'd been studying a complex web of financial transactions. "Send him in, please." David Chen entered, looking tired but determined. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd become genuinely invested in Mark's case, partly because of the legal challenges it presented, and partly because of his respect for Sarah's efforts to help her ex-husband, despite their acrimonious divorce. "I have some interesting news," David said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "The FBI has finally gotten access to Richard Hamilton's personal financial records, and there are some transactions that don't make sense." Sarah leaned forward. "What kind of transactions?" "Large payments to something called Whitman Consulting Services, dating back almost 2 years. The amounts are significant. We're talking about several $100,000 over time." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "David, there is no Whitman Consulting Services. Mark never had a business by that name, and neither do I." "That's what I was afraid you'd say." David pulled out a folder thick with bank statements and wire transfer records. "Someone's been using a fake business entity with your ex-husband's name to receive payments from the fraudulent investment fund. This isn't just about Mark being a victim of fraud. Someone's been actively using his identity as part of the scam." Sarah studied the documents, her mind racing. "This changes everything, doesn't it? If someone's been impersonating Mark or using his identity fraudulently, that's a completely different kind of crime." "Exactly. And it might explain why Richard Hamilton targeted Mark specifically. If someone was already using his name and identity, Mark would have been the perfect Fall guy. When the fraud was discovered, all the evidence would point to him as a co-conspirator rather than a victim. Sarah felt a surge of anger on Mark's behalf. The divorce had been difficult, and Mark's behavior had been hurtful. But no one deserved to be set up as the patsy in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. There's something else, David continued. I've been comparing the timeline of these fake payments to Mark's actual financial records from your divorce proceedings. Several of the largest transfers to Whitman Consulting Services happened during your separation, when Mark was required by your prenup to disclose major financial activities. Sarah understood immediately. So not only was someone impersonating Mark, but they were doing it during a time when he was legally required to report any significant financial transactions. If we hadn't caught this, it would have looked like Mark was deliberately hiding income during the divorce, which would have been grounds for fraud charges against Mark personally, separate from the investment scam. David's expression was grim. Sarah, I think someone's been planning to destroy your ex-husband for a very long time. The question is who and why. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Then something occurred to her, a memory that had been nagging at her for weeks. David, at Mark's divorce party, there was someone there I didn't recognize from his usual crowd. Mark mentioned him a few times during our separation, someone new who was giving him financial advice. Do you remember a name? Tommy something. Tommy Rodriguez, I think. He worked in financial consulting, and Mark was always talking about these great investment opportunities Tommy had told him about. David made a note. I'll have the FBI look into anyone by that name connected to the case. He paused, studying Sarah's expression. There's something else, isn't there? Sarah nodded slowly. I've been thinking about the timeline. Mark's most reckless investment decisions all started about 2 years ago, right around the time these fake payments began. What if someone wasn't just using his identity for fraud? What if they were actively manipulating him, feeding him bad investment advice and setting him up to fail? You mean like a long-term con? Exactly. Think about it. If you wanted to destroy someone financially and legally, what would be the perfect plan? First, you use their identity to receive fraudulent payments, creating a paper trail that makes them look guilty. Then, you gain their trust and convince them to make increasingly risky investments. Finally, when everything collapses, all the evidence points to them as the mastermind while you disappear. David stared at her. Sarah, if you're right, this isn't just fraud. It's a targeted campaign to destroy Mark's life. But why? What would anyone gain from that? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Mark's personality, his business connections, and the enemies he might have made over the years. Then something clicked, a conversation she'd overheard during one of Mark's business calls during their marriage. David, I need to make a call. There's someone who might have answers. After David left, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring out at Grant Park and trying to piece together a puzzle that was more complex than anyone had realized. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah? It was Mark, and he sounded terrible. I just got a call from David Chen. He said you'd found something important in the financial records? Mark, where are you right now? At Jake's apartment. Why? I need you to think very carefully about something. About 2 years ago, you started making different kinds of investments, riskier ones. What changed? Who was giving you advice? There was a long pause. There were several people. Why are you asking? Mark, someone's been using your name to receive payments from the fraud scheme. For almost 2 years, there's been a fake business called Whitman Consulting Services that's been getting money from Richard Hamilton. Someone's been setting you up. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. Mark? Are you still there? Tommy, Mark whispered. Tommy Rodriguez. He's the one who introduced me to Richard Hamilton. He's the one who convinced me the blockchain investments were safe. And he... Mark's voice trailed off. He what, Mark? He knew about our prenup. He knew about the disclosure requirements. Sarah, I told him everything. About our divorce, about our financial arrangements, about the timeline for finalizing everything. I thought he was trying to help me make good investments so I could prove I didn't need you. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Mark, I need you to write down everything you remember about Tommy Rodriguez. Every conversation, every piece of advice he gave you, every time he mentioned specific investments or opportunities. Can you do that? Sarah, if you're right, if he's been planning this for 2 years... Mark's voice was shaking. I've lost everything. My home, my savings, my reputation. What am I supposed to do now? Sarah looked out her window at the city skyline, thinking about the past month and how dramatically both of their lives had changed. Mark had celebrated their divorce as his liberation from her supposedly limiting influence, never realizing that her financial caution had been protecting him from exactly this kind of disaster. Now he was broke, homeless, and facing potential criminal charges, while she had a new career helping other people avoid the mistakes he'd made. The irony was almost overwhelming, but Sarah found that instead of feeling vindicated, she felt genuinely sad for the man she'd once loved. Mark, I want you to know something. I'm going to help you get through this. Not because I want us to get back together, but because it's the right thing to do. And because I think I know who's really behind this. Who? Sarah took a deep breath, preparing to share the secret she'd been keeping. The one piece of information that would change both of their lives forever. Mark, do you remember Marcus Williams, your former business partner from about 5 years ago? There was another long silence. Marcus Williams had been Mark's partner in a tech startup that had failed spectacularly, costing both men significant amounts of money and ending their friendship in a bitter legal dispute. What does Marcus have to do with this? I never told you this, but Marcus contacted me during our separation. He wanted to know about our finances, about your investment habits, about the prenup details. I thought he was just being vindictive about the old business dispute, so I didn't tell him anything. But now you think he's been planning this for years. Mark finished. I think Marcus Williams is Tommy Rodriguez, Mark. I think your former business partner has been systematically destroying your life for the past 2 years, using your trust against you and setting you up to take the fall for someone else's crimes. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood yet. But for the first time since his world had collapsed, Mark felt something other than despair. He felt anger. And for the first time since their divorce, Sarah and Mark were working together toward the same goal, exposing the truth and getting justice for the elaborate con that had destroyed his life and threatened hers. The secret was out, and everything was about to change again. Outside Sarah's office window, the October sun was finally breaking through the clouds that had covered Chicago for weeks. It felt like a sign that perhaps, after all the darkness and deception, the truth was finally ready to come to light. But as Sarah and Mark were about to discover, some secrets have consequences that reach far beyond anything either of them could have imagined. The man who had orchestrated Mark's downfall wasn't finished with either of them yet, and his final move would test everything they thought they knew about justice, forgiveness, and the price of starting over. The real story was just beginning.